If there is no feeling, there cannot be great art.
The happy ending is one of the first and most essential staples of story we learn as a kid. You traverse the impossible to evolve and win. We see it in books, movies, and even games. Praise the sun. But after your 110th happy ever after, and a little growing up, you start to observe that life actually isn't all sunshine and roses. That darkness exists and sometimes prevails. That happy endings in reality aren't guaranteed. Suddenly, dark art feels strangely appealing, like there ought to be some meaning to be found in its cold, demented aura. I was in middle school when they had us read The Illustrated Man, a collection of loosely connected short stories about sci-fi, space, and existential horror. The Long Rain, formerly titled Death by Rain, comes from this book and is one of the darkest tales I've ever read. It stuck with me all these years because of how the characters in it are driven down a descent into madness, slowly but surely meeting their deaths just by rain. These 4 astronauts live in a world where little droplets of water hit their heads constantly, because on this planet, it's always raining and it never stops. This is a story about suffering, hope, and hopelessness in that order, repeating on a loop until collapsing somewhere in between. It's closest compared to water drop torture, but if that long and punishing retribution embodied its own world at grand scale. In life, when the rain comes, we're told that this too shall pass. We're advised to keep our heads up, reminded that the sun will always come again. That if you can just keep pushing forward, there's gonna be a light at the end of the tunnel. This is hope. Hope for a happy ending. But if happy ever after is the classic storybook end, then what does it mean to break that mold? What does it mean when the rain never stops? While there have been a couple of film adaptations to The Long Rain, I think what shines about Bradbury's work is his incredible knack for descriptive language that invites our imagination to dance, painting pictures in our minds with each passing word, pictures that are equally beautiful and terrifying. So I feel it's best to experience this story by reading its original form and let Bradbury's prose do its thing. Also, this is what I read in middle school, and I like revisiting the same piece of art that stuck with me all these years to gain a deeper understanding. We may refer to the adaptations from the Illustrated Man movie and the Ray Bradbury Theater to supplement our analysis, but we'll mainly be sticking to the source material. Alright, let's dive in to The Long Rain. We're treated to an opening paragraph that introduces us to life on Venus, which is simply a never-ending experience of rain. The rain that continues and never stops continuing. It was a rain to drown all rains and the memory of rains. We're told how it cut the trees like scissors and shrank men's hands into the hands of wrinkled apes. So already we can see that Bradbury is eloquent with his depictions of the storm, but his greatest showcase of personification is yet to come. For now, our focus pivots. 4 astronauts are lost in the rain, suffering. But where there's suffering, there's the potential for hope. While they plunge through pound after pound of pouring rain, the only thought on their minds, the only goal that matters, is getting to the sun dome. That's where they want to be. The sun domes are havens of dryness and warmth that people built all over Venus, filled with warm food, dry clothes, and of course, a glowing sun in between. The sun domes are an imagination of a brighter future, literally of a light at the end of the tunnel. This is hope. If only they can get to the next sun dome, they'll be all right. That'll be their happy ending. At least, that's what they tell themselves. Because here they were. The 2 men sat together in the rain, and behind them sat 2 other men who were wet and tired and slumped like clay that was melting. One of the men says, "I've lived here for 10 years and I never saw a minute or even a second when it wasn't pouring." The crew's lieutenant says they better get going. Important to note here that there's some banter from the crew about the lieutenant lying to keep them moving forward, Them asking him, how much longer do we have? He's like, 1 more hour. When really he doesn't know how long it is, but he'll say that to keep them moving or to keep them happy. It's part jokes, part cope, and that's going to come into play later. Lieutenant says, no, now I'm lying to myself. This is one of those times when you've got to lie. I can't take much more of this. Put a pin in that. That's going to come into play later.
The intellect is a great danger to creativity.
The intellect is a danger to creativity?
Terrible danger, because you begin to rationalize and make up reasons for things instead of staying with your own basic truth. Who you are, what you want to be. And I've had a sign over my typewriter for 25 years now which reads, don't think. You must never think at the typewriter, you must feel. And then your intellect is always buried in that feeling anyway. You collect up a lot of data, you do a lot of thinking away from your typewriter. But at the typewriter, you should be living. It should be a living experience.
So many elements of the story are effortlessly symbolic for hard times, for going through dark times. The rain that never stops, the dreams of a light at the end of the tunnel, and the fact that the men are completely and utterly lost. It tells us there was no direction anywhere, only what the compass said. There was a gray sky and rain falling and jungle and a path, and far back behind them somewhere, a rocket in which they had ridden and fallen. A rocket in which lay 2 of their friends, dead and dripping in the rain. So the only point of reassurance at this moment in time is their compass. That's all they've got to work with. They have no idea where they're going. It's just gray and rain. They're trying to leave from the ship that they came from to find the sun dome before they end up like their friends. So they're following that compass like their life depends on it, because it does. And here we're immersed into the lieutenant's world, who feels rain and cold on every part of his body, who couldn't sleep the night before or any night for the last 30 days because, as he says, who can sleep with rain slamming on their head, banging away? I'd give anything for a hat. Anything at all. Just so it wouldn't hit my head anymore. I get headaches. My head is sore. It hurts all the time. Another remarked that the beating rain felt like BB shot. I don't know how long I can take it. A drop of water by itself is harmless, but repeated over and over again and never stopping with no relief will surely drive you insane. The crew, some of which are now named, the lieutenant, Simmons, Pickard, and a 4th guy, prepare an inflatable boat to cross a river, and they dream of their salvation. The sun dome. A roof over their head, a warm interior, food, drinks, drying off. The answer to all their problems. It almost sounds too good to be true. There were some descriptions earlier of the rain sort of bleaching everyone and everything, and here it says they were white as mushrooms, as white as lye was. And I thought that was a really good one. Nice job, Ray. Venus bleached everything away in a few months. Even the jungle was an immense cartoon nightmare. For how could the jungle be green with no sun, with always rain falling and always dusk? Here we are. Their journey's about to pay off. All that effort is leading to this crew's happy ending, because in life, when the hard times come, you just keep on pushing. There's a way out. There's a light at that end of the tunnel, and it's going to be so worth it. And then Simmons thinks he sees something ahead and sprints on. They found him in a little clearing, and they stopped and looked at him and what he had discovered. The rocket ship. It was lying where they had left it. Somehow, they had circled back and were where they had started. So tragically, their journey and hard work, trekking through the rain, enduring all that suffering, has brought them precisely back to square one. The lieutenant figures an electrical storm must have thrown off their compasses. Well, what's there to do but start over? And then Simmons' next response is what really got to me, and is what made the situation sink in for real. Good Lord, we're not any closer to anywhere. This is hopelessness. You know, this line really struck me because it really speaks to how I've felt in some of my lowest moments. It really captures, in a sentence, how I felt in some of my most depressed moments in life. How when you've poured so much effort and soul into something, how everything is riding on that hard work paying off, only for it to completely fall apart and go nowhere. To set out for something, to feel lost, to feel suffering, but to press on anyway like you should, only to end up literally right back where you started. Not any closer to anywhere. That's gotta be one of the worst feelings in the world. The rain continued. Just as the men's spirits are deflating back into their suffering, feeling the rain that was issuing forth water from every pore, they hear a roar in the distance, and the monster came out of the rain. The monster was supported upon by 1,000 electric blue legs. It walked swiftly and terribly. It struck down a leg with a driving blow. Everywhere a leg struck, a tree fell and burned. Great whiffs of ozone filled the rainy air, and smoke blew away and was broken up by the rain. The monster was a half-mile wide and a mile high, and it felt on the ground like a great blind thing. Sometimes, for a moment, it had no legs at all. And then, in an instant, 1,000 whips would fall out of its belly, white-blue whips to sting the jungle. "There's the electrical storm," said one of the men. Now, is that not some of the most badass personification you've ever heard? Ray's portrayals of the rain thus far have been very effective, but this paragraph about the monster, this description of the thunderstorm as a giant walking monster, is just extraordinary. It makes it feel way scarier, like it's a conscious entity, but on the grandeur and scale of a god.
You rely heavily upon intuition?
Oh, completely. Everything of mine is intuitive. All the poetry I've written, I couldn't possibly tell you how I did it. I don't know anything about the rhythms or the schemes or the inner rhymes or any of this sort of thing. It comes from 40 years of reading poetry and having heroes that I loved. Feeling, again. I love Shakespeare. I don't intellectualize about him. I love Gerard Manley Hopkins. I don't intellectualize about him. I love Dylan Thomas. I don't know what in the hell he's writing about half the time, but he sounds good.
The idea of this massive thunderstorm scurrying across the planet like an electric spider with 1,000 legs, it makes my skin crawl. I mean, it makes the exterior layer of my rock crawl.
True.
The lieutenant, still performing his duty as leader, commands the men to lie down, until it approaches them closer and closer, until the monster came and stood over them. It dropped down 10 blue bolts of lightning which struck the rocket. The rocket flashed like a beaten gong and gave off a metal ringing. The monster let down 15 more bolts which danced about in a ridiculous pantomime, feeling of the jungle and the watery soil, which is when one of the men foolishly jumps up against the lieutenant's commands. The man who had leaped up was now running, like someone in a great hall of pillars. This is where I'd like to pop in and just say, this is why the original version of the story is so magnificent. Like, you just can't translate these descriptions of how the storm looks and feels to the astronauts to the screen in all of its glory. Not easily, anyway. He ran and dodged between the pillars, and then at last a dozen of the pillars slammed down, and there was the sound a fly makes when landing upon the grill wires of an exterminator. And here's Ray's very authentic, real, sort of tongue-in-cheek descriptions, which I think hit really hard. To reduce this human life to a quick little fly zap is crazy work. But wait, there's more! It continues when they approach the body. The narration tells us, the body was twisted steel, wrapped in burned leather. It looked like a wax dummy that had been thrown into an incinerator and pulled out after the wax had sunk to the charcoal skeleton. Ugh. So that guy shouldn't have done that, but, you know, this story is about coping with death, and that guy freaked out. Maybe that guy just couldn't take it anymore. You know, he got in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, and he fucking chose flight. Maybe part of him wanted to die. He got cooked by the monster. And then there were 3. The last we hear of the monster is that it walked off on blue bolts of lightning and was gone. And just like that, gone it was. Despite their tragic loss, the crew pressed on in search of the Sun Dome. It was now just the lieutenant, Simmons, and Pickard. What they've experienced has been brutal to say the least, but they must keep pressing on to get to the light. They crossed a whole bunch of other land and river proceeding south. The rain continued, and it never stopped. Simmons saw it first. There it is! There's what? The Sun Dome! And there it was, at long last. Before they can even get there, their spirits are lifted. That's what hope does to you. It uplifts you out of the suffering, bathed by the light. They ran faster. The yellow glow grew brighter. They stepped through the door. The sun dome was empty and dark. What had been long imagined and built up as their great escape, at least at this location, is just another place to get rained on. They theorized that the life on Venus probably did it, but who did it doesn't matter. What matters is that there was still no relief in sight, and the rain continued. But without their coffee, their fresh warm buns, or their refuge from the grueling downpour of rain, they reckon their best bet is to proceed to the next sun dome, which shouldn't be too far from here. And right there, merely introducing the idea of hope once again, while teetering on the line between hope and hopelessness, is enough to push Pickard towards the ladder, and his spirit begins to crack. If only the rain wouldn't hit my head just for a few minutes. If only I could remember what it's like to not be bothered. He put his hands on his skull and held it tight. I remember when I was in school, a bully used to sit in back of me and pinch me and pinch me and pinch me every 5 minutes all day long. He did that for weeks and months. My arms were sore and black and blue all the time, and I thought I'd go crazy from being pinched. One day I must have gone a little mad from being hurt, and I turned around and took a metal tri-square used in mechanical drawing, and I almost killed that bastard. I almost cut his lousy head off. I almost took his eye out before they dragged me out of the room, and I kept yelling, "Why don't he leave me alone? Why don't he leave me alone?" "Brother!" His hands clenched the bone of his head, shaking, tightening, his eyes shut. But what do I do now? Who do I hit? Who do I tell to lay off? Stop bothering me. This damn rain, like the pinching, always on you. That's all you hear. That's all you feel. The lieutenant attempts to reassure the spiraling Pickard, who has now lost all hope. Maybe none of the sun domes are actually working. Maybe they're all gutted. They manage to get him to press on for 4 more hours. And then they collapse, exhausted from weeks without sleep, and try to get an ounce of rest, which they couldn't, and instead, exhausted and fixed in a perpetual state of sensory overload, the lieutenant felt the rain on his body. There were things that crawled on his skin, things grew upon him in layers. Drops fell and touched other drops, and they became streams that trickled over his body, and while these moved down his flesh, the small growths of the forest took root in his clothing. After feeling the rain on his face, his neck, his back, his legs, he desperately tried to brush the water off his skin. He floundered and struck something else and knew that it was Simmons, standing up in the rain, sneezing moisture, coughing and choking. And then Pickard was up, shouting, running about. So the lieutenant's freakout has domino affected into the other two, resulting in Pickard having another freakout. And as far as descriptive language goes, there's just so many juicy paragraphs in this story. This next one, from Pickard's point of view, and Pickard's freakout, is surreal, and I love it. Just pay attention to how this description freezes time. He fired off his gun 6 times at the night sky. In the flashes of powdery illumination, they could see armies of raindrops, suspended as in a vast, motionless amber. For an instant, hesitating as if shocked by the explosion. 15 billion droplets, 15 billion tears, 15 billion ornaments, jewels standing out against a white velvet viewing board. And then, with the light gone, the drops which had waited to have their pictures taken, which had suspended their downward rush, fell upon them singing in an insect cloud of coldness and pain. This is easily the most poetic way I've ever heard someone describe watching rainfall. I mean, the drops which had waited to have their pictures taken, bro? Oh my god, that's rich. That's insane.
You give us a very strong impression you love your work.
Oh, intensely. I wouldn't be in it. If I ever stop loving it, I'll shift it and go over into something else. Yeah, I don't think life is worth living unless you're doing something you love completely, so that you get out of bed in the morning and want to rush to do it. If you're doing something mediocre, if you're doing something to fill in time, life really isn't worth living. I can't understand people not living at the top of their emotions constantly, living with their enthusiasms, living with some sense of joy.
And just as the water was frozen in that instant, Pickard himself now stood frozen, wholly and entirely giving up on life, embracing hopelessness. Simmons understands, but the lieutenant doesn't. So Simmons tells him, this is how people give up here. Here on Venus, they breathe the water. They let themselves drown in the long rain. For Pickard has become numb. He can't even feel you, said Simmons. A few days in this rain and you don't have any face or any legs or hands. The lieutenant looked at his own hand in horror. He could no longer feel it. Once again, just looking at how much damage is being done to these human beings just by rain. All you need to do is make it never stop, and now it's going to bleach everything, erode away and cut away at everything it touches, drive it to madness, drive them to numbness, in one way or another, going insane and approaching their demise. And just like that, in an instant, it happens. I'll show you what we can do. Simmons fired his gun, and Pickard fell into the raining earth. Simmons asserts that it's quicker this way, that Pickard was already insane and he would have just drowned. The lieutenant blinked at the body. But you killed him. They walk off into the rain and proceed to the next sundome. And so now we are back to somewhere in between suffering and hope if we're feeling a little insane ourselves. With only 2 men left, they press on exhausted until Simmons starts to realize he himself is starting to feel numb. By Christ, he said, and touched his ears. My ears, they've gone out on me. All the pouring rain finally numbed me right down to the bone. I just don't give a damn anymore. I'm not crazy yet, but I'm the next thing to it. I don't want to go out that way. As soon as you get out of sight, I'm going to use this gun on myself. Simmons is now numb, now broken, anchored in hopelessness. Simmons, who just put Pickard out of his misery, is now eyeing the same fate for himself. He rejects the slow descent into madness. He'd rather go to self-checkout. After fighting with him for a little bit, the lieutenant reluctantly lets him go and moves on without him, failing his duty to lead these men to safety, to victory, out of the dark and into the light. The rain continued, and it never stopped. The lieutenant didn't even hear the sound of the gun. And then there was one. The final character, the lieutenant, by himself, assuming the role of main character. He was unable to save his crew, but is he able to save himself? And now, we've come full circle to the lieutenant lying about how much further there is to go, to trick oneself to keep going. It's a last resort survival mechanism meant to do anything necessary to keep moving forward, even if that means lying to and deluding oneself. Admittedly, having told them that he was lying to get them to shut up and keep moving, or rather to keep them happy, now he is indeed lying to himself to do the same thing. Another 5 minutes, he tells himself. This is how the lieutenant keeps that small glimmer of hope alive throughout his suffering. By bordering on delusion. But even he, now the main character, now the only character, after all his journeying and suffering, is experiencing painful bouts of hopelessness. Another 5 minutes and then I'll walk into the sea and keep walking. We weren't made for this. No Earthman was or ever will be able to take it. Your nerves, your nerves. He floundered his way through a sea of slush and foliage and came to a small hill. At a distance, there was a faint yellow smudge in the cold veils of water. The next sundome. The lieutenant starts to run towards it, but then fear sets in. He worries. What if it's the same one from before? You know? This has happened before, where they thought they were moving towards something, and they ended up right back where they started. How do we know that this is a different one? How do we know that this is a different sundome? And so here he stands in duality, somewhere in between hope and hopelessness. Maybe this is his happy ever after, his happy ending, or maybe it's another false positive, another punked moment, another gotcha in the cruel game of life on Venus, where the rain never stops, even for a second. Just then, he slipped and fell, Lie here, he thought. It's the wrong one. Lie here. It's no use. Drink all you want. No. The lieutenant musters the strength to get up and press on and proceeds to the sun dome. And he gets up to the door and he opens it, and inside he finds a steaming pot of hot chocolate complete with marshmallow, rich chicken meat and fresh cut tomatoes and onions, a fresh towel, a change of uniform, coffee and books, and of course, most of all, at long last, the sun that floated and permeated comforting warmth from the center of the room. It hung in the center of the room, large and yellow and warm. It made not a sound, and there was no sound in the room. The door was shut, and the rain only a memory to his tingling body. The sun hung high in the blue sky of the room, warm, hot, yellow, and very fine. He walked forward, tearing off his clothes as he went. And so, just like that, by pressing on, even when it was hard, the lieutenant finds his happy ending. Or does he? Because you see, there's a big question of this story. There's a big moment of interpretation that's critical to what this story is and what this story means. That depending on how you look at it, means all the difference between light and dark. Because in that moment when the lieutenant fell to the ground and thought about not getting up, about giving up, this guy who had been lying to and deluding himself to keep going, did he cross the threshold into insanity and hallucinate getting up and going into the sun dome?
We are the tension-collecting animals of this world. We are that particular creature in the world who decides to put away violence most of the time. And in order to inhabit cities, we put away actions, we save things. We are the only creature in the world that does this. And so we need artists, we need people like myself who take hold of a piece of reality and say, this is what it is. We've saved up attention for tears. So I, as a writer, come along and try to help you to cry at the right time. We save up attention of laughter, perhaps for our silly politicians. I come along as a writer and help you to laugh. We save up tensions of murdering. The wonderful fact about civilization is that most people do not murder, that most of us are peace-loving, that we do make do in the best sense. So I come along with a story and enable you for an hour to murder so that the next day you don't have to do it in reality. And Nietzsche puts it beautifully. We have art that we do not die of reality.
Is this an ode to perseverance or an examination of the human spirit facing a slow and painful death by 15 billion raindrops?